Hello there, and welcome to this guidance on the National Plant Monitoring Scheme Broadleaved Woodland Habitats. I'm Ben Averis, and I'll be taking you through a sort of illustrated tour of this habitat. And here's a picture to start with. It's a very wide-ranging habitat that covers a whole lot of different kinds of broadleaved woodland and hedges as well. And actually, before we get stuck into the sort of details of it, I've written a wee poem. I've begun with a lot of these presentations with little informal poems about the kind of habitat. So here's one about broadleaved woods. Broadleaved woods, the leaves are broad. Let's leave the leaves, I'm getting bored. Attention span ain't much good for a man who stood in a broadleaved wood. Trunks and branches, textured bark, rough or smooth, light or dark, different species, birch and oak, just the stuff for a boring bloke to look at on a lovely day when other folk are out at play. Trees grow tall, but trunks are grey, and leaves will fall the broad-leaved way. Down and down, looking poor, boring brown, green no more. Well, there's a good start to the broad-leaved woods. It's not that bad. It's not that bad, really. In fact, they're pretty good places, really. They can be. You know, let me look at all that moss, that bright coloured moss in that picture there. Anyway, let's move on to the next page and make a start on things. So here we are. This on this page we can see that this big broad habitat type, which includes all kind of deciduous woodland, even plantations, but not more kind of garden-like or commercial ones. It also includes hedges with native species anyway, and it's divided into these three subtypes, three what they call fine scale habitats. One is dry woodland, one is wet woodland, and the other one is the hedges. The dry woodland includes yew woodland. Not that there's very much of that. Yew woodland is pretty uncommon in this country, but where it occurs, ecologically it has a lot in common with various kinds of deciduous woodland, so it's included here. So what we can do is start with the dry deciduous woodland over the next lot of pages, taking a look at that, and then move on to the wet woodland and then the hedgerows. Dry deciduous woodland, an introductory page here which tells us that the tree canopy can be incredibly varied, so many different kinds of tree species we can get there. Shrubs likewise, and the ground layer equally variable. So what we can do here is look through it in an ordering that's based on the kind of soils that we find, because soils in these dry deciduous woods vary a lot from acid ones through neutral ones to more calcareous or base-rich ones, and each of those three groups, acid, neutral, basic, has a particular characteristic set of species that helps to define it. So we'll begin with the acid ones. And here are a couple of pictures of dry deciduous woodland on acid soils. On these acid soils, the canopy of trees is mainly birches and oaks, and it can be either species of birch, downy or silver, and either species of oak, the sessile or the pedunculate. The ground layer can be very heathy, as long as it's not too grazed, and then it'll tend to be more grassy and mossy. So on the left we got a picture of downy birch in the West Highlands over a heathy ground layer with a lot of heather in it. On the right, silver birch in Speyside further east with heather and blaeberry and other species on the ground. And here we have a couple of pictures of oak woodland on well-drained, reasonably well-drained acid soils. One in Wales on the left and one in Western Scotland on the right. The ground layer can be similarly heathy or grassy or mossy beneath the oak, just as much as beneath the birch. Here is another picture of silver birch woodland in Speyside, at the same place as the one we had a couple of pages back actually. Focusing a little bit more here on the ground layer of the vegetation, which is very heathy. You can see ordinary heather, there's a bit of bell heather with its purple flowers there, and a lot of blaeberry or bilberry, whichever word you want to use depending on where you are or which word you prefer. It's a very heathy ground layer. That's very characteristic of a lot of these woods on these acid soils, as I mentioned earlier, as long as the grazing isn't too heavy, because these dwarf shrubs, those two heathers and the blaeberry, are very palatable to animals such as deer and sheep. So if there's a lot of grazing around, higher density of those animals, they can graze a lot of that stuff, browse rather, a lot of those dwarf shrubs. So the dwarf shrub layer will be reduced in its extent and its height, and correspondingly there will be an increase in the abundance of grasses. Here we've got close-up photos of those same three dwarf shrub species. Heather, with its very tiny leaves and very pale pinky flowers, very, very common dwarf shrub. Bell heather, with its rather bigger, slightly rather darker pink flowers, longer leaves in whorls of 3, and bilberry or blaeberry again, with very different oval leaves, bigger oval leaves with toothed edges, and they fall off in the winter, whereas the two heathers are evergreen. The bilberry is always recognisable by those green stems with the longitudinal ridges on them, a bit like the stems of broom, but broom is an awful lot bigger. And blaeberry also has those dark bluey edible fruits. Cowberry looks kind of similar in a way. This is closely related, but the leaves are evergreen, darker, not so toothed, and the leaf margins are kind of slightly rolled under as well, so you wouldn't really see the teeth quite so well even if they were there. Berries kind of go reddish. It does grow mostly in places that are a bit cooler, a bit further, a bit of a more northern and higher altitude distribution overall. Wavy hairgrass, those lovely opened out, sort of airy looking flower heads there with rather pale silvery, slightly shiny spikelets at the ends of these long thin branches. The branches are held up much closer to the stem, by the way, when in the early part of the season when they've just emerged. Leaves of the wavy hairgrass are very thin and wiry, no more than about 1 millimetre across, and they come in tufts. We'll see some of those in another photograph. And here is that photo of a sward, an extensive sward of wavy hairgrass growing beneath a canopy of oak on well-drained acid soils here in the Lammermuir Hills of southeast Scotland. The leaves you can see there, they're very thin and wiry leaves, and the plant's quite densely sort of tufted, tussocky looking thing. There are quite a few other kinds of grasses that we see in Britain with very narrow, wiry looking leaves, but they grow mostly outside woods. You can get little bits of red fescue or sheep's fescue or mat grass here and there in the rather better lit parts of a wood, but mostly, for the most part, if you see a lot of very thin leaved, wiry leaved grass in a wood, it's most likely to be this species. And the sward of dominant wavy hairgrass here is an indication that grazing has probably been pretty intensive, and if it weren't so heavily grazed, we'd probably be looking here at a rather taller and more heathy ground layer of vegetation. Here are a couple of pictures, drawings I've done of very mossy acid woodland in the West Highlands. In these places, the west of Scotland, the west of Ireland, and parts of England and Wales, the Lake District and the uplands of Western Wales, and here and there in southwest England as well, we get woodland which is very, very mossy, lots of mosses and liverworts and lichens. Huge richness in these plants in response to the climate, which is very wet and also kind of equable. So winters are really mild and summers don't get too hot. And those conditions, which are met with in not that large an extent of the planet, really, are ones that give rise to this incredible wealth of mosses, liverworts and lichens, including many species that are intolerant of more extreme climates that go drier or colder or hotter. So here we are, a temperate rainforest here in Scotland. Here we can see differences between the downy birch and the silver birch. The silver birch leaves look more kind of jaggy looking with that double-toothed margin, and the leaf tip tends to be drawn out into a longer and finer point. Also the trunk, at least the lower parts of the trunk of the mature silver birch, are very distinctive with that sort of thick grey bark that's cut quite deeply into those fissures. The young twigs also of the downy birch are really quite hairy, but not so in the silver birch. And here are the two oaks. Pedunculate oak with its shorter leaf stalk and the leaf base being kind of lobed at the very base, very abrupt beginning to the leaf blade, compared with the sessile oak that has a longer leaf stalk and the leaf blade tapering gradually out from that leaf stalk. If you've got the acorns, yeah, you can tell them that way as well, because the acorns are unstalked in sessile oak and definitely stalked in the pedunculate oak. Both species can grow on these acid soils in both upland and lowland areas. It had been thought by many a long time ago that sessile oak was the main one in the hills and pedunculate oak the main one down in the lowlands, but both can occur in both areas, and you also get a lot of hybrids. They're very common, in which you have leaves that have a reasonable length of leaf stalk. It can be a centimetre long and a very abrupt beginning to the leaf base, not so gradually tapering. So that combination of features of both species tends to indicate hybrids, and hybrids are very common. These three little herbs are very common on the ground in acidic woodland. Wood sorrel, that's pretty unmistakable. Its leaves look like clover leaves with 3 leaflets each, but the sides of the leaflets don't have the little teeth that they do on the clovers, and the side veins in each leaflet aren't so numerous and straight and parallel as they are in the clovers. You don't really get clovers in acid woodlands anyway, and obviously if you've got the flowers, those wood sorrel flowers are unmistakable. Tormentil, easy to tell with its little yellow flowers, 4 petals, very occasionally 5, but mostly 4. And the leaves with 3 leaflets with sort of teeth along the edges towards the tips of the leaflets, and also a couple of little stipules like little miniature leaflets at the bases, so they can look like they've got 5 leaflets. Very common little plant. And then heath bedstraw, a very low and creeping one with tiny little narrow leaves in whorls of between 4 and 8, and little clusters of tiny little white flowers. Okay, so moving on to woodland or deciduous woodland on more or less neutral soils here. Wide range of tree and shrub species, with some overlap with what we've seen on the acid soils. Oak and birch figure still very prominently here, but they're joined by various other ones, including rowan. Actually, you can get rowan on acid soils too. Goat willow, sycamore, hazel becomes more common here. Quite a lot of things. Beech can grow on these sorts of soils, and it can also grow on acid soils and more basic soils, quite a wide-ranging species. Hazel. Hazel is more common here on these neutral soils than on the more acid ones. Generally likes neutral to basic soils, and it can actually be the dominant species in the canopy in some woods, especially in the far west of Scotland and in the west of Ireland. In those places, actually, it can have a terrific assemblage of mosses, liverworts and lichens growing on its stems, and interesting flora growing on the ground too. Those orange things on the picture in the picture on the left are actually a fungus. They look a bit like kind of lichen, but it's a fungus called Hypocreopsis rhododendri, or hazel gloves they call it. Aspen does well on these kind of soils as well. It's not a terribly common tree, it's always pretty interesting to find it, and it can be a good habitat growing, on its trunks there for certain mosses, liverworts, and lichens and fur insects as well. So there's quite a lot of interest among conservationists and ecologists for aspen these days. So if you find a grove of aspen trees like that photo on the left, it's a pretty good chance you're on these sorts of soils, more or less neutral to slightly acid. On the ground in these areas of woodland on neutral to slightly acid soils, we have a mixture of grasses, herbs and ferns. So yeah, we tend to say goodbye to the dwarf shrubs of the acid soils and hello to broader leaved grasses and some other herbs that we don't get on the acid soils. We may say hello to them. I don't know how much of a conversation we're really going to have with them. But yeah, not so much of the wiry leaved grass, the wavy hair grass, the acid soils, broader leaved grasses here. And a range of tufted ferns as well as bracken, which are shared with what we saw on the acid soils as well. But the herb component is a little bit better developed here. Here is a rather well grazed example of this category of woodland. Ground vegetation, mainly grasses and bracken. If it wasn't so grazed, we'd probably see more in the way of either tufted ferns, the Dryopteris, the buckler ferns, those kind of things, or other species such as bramble, honeysuckle, or greater woodrush. In this kind of habitat, we can also get bluebells. That's why I drew some in that picture I did in that insect, because I thought the picture kind of looked a little bit dull somehow without them. The photograph looks okay, I suppose, but I wanted to spice up my drawing, so I put them in what is indeed the appropriate sort of habitat. Here are some real bluebells, of course, and the main habitat for bluebell is indeed woodland on neutral to slightly acid soils, especially beneath oak and birch. We also can find quite a lot of bluebell in woods on more basic soils where we get more ash as well, but it does particularly well in oak woods, I would say, and also out in the open sometimes we find it under bracken, especially in the west. It's a western species in Europe as a whole. We might take it for granted in this country because it's pretty common, but on a European scale has a strongly oceanic distribution, and Britain is an important part of the world for it. It's handy to be able to tell our native bluebell from these non-native ones, which are mainly hybrids with the Spanish bluebell, which people have had in their gardens, and it's hybridized, and the hybrids have spread, have naturalized and got into woodland all over the place and along roadside verges. The hybrids have wider leaves, up to about 3.5 centimeters, compared with up to about 1.5 centimeters in the native species, and its flowers taper out wider. They stick out kind of in all directions around the flower stalk, compared with our native one, where they tend to dangle down on one side and the whole flower head can be a bit almost drooping or turned over to one side of it. A few little details about the shape of the flower. Yeah, it's sort of a bit more parallel sided in the native one, and the difference in the colour of the anthers. But the leaves, the width of the leaves is always a pretty good guide as well, even when you haven't got the flowers. Here's an example of some much less grazed woodland on similar soils again. A lot of bramble and the tufted fern there, male fern and bramble, both very palatable species. So they're doing very well here in this sort of tall, more tangly ground layer. This is a funny plant. It kind of looks a bit like something's gone wrong somewhere, but it hasn't. It has two parts. First, what happens is shoots come out, and they have leaves that look a bit like little rhododendron leaves, really, sticking out in all directions, quite dark, same sort of shape more or less as rhododendron leaves. And then the following year it puts up another length of shoots carrying on with these funny yellowy green flower heads. What it is, it's wood spurge, as I've written on the top of the sheet anyway, so you don't need me to tell you that. It's a very southern species found in woodland on these kind of neutral to slightly acid soils. Some nice looking herbs here that we can find on these same kind of soils. Primrose, pretty unmistakable plant, and common dog violets. If you find violets beneath birch or oak trees, or in places where you get bracken, probably going to be common dog violet. There are other kind of violets, like there's early dog violets, but that's a southern species, and it grows on more basic soils beneath trees such as ash and elm. Germander speedwell, that's a distinctive plant, not so much because of its flowers and its leaves, which kind of look a bit like other things, although the leaves are fairly distinctive. Those toothed edges and the fact the leaves come in opposite pairs. But what's always a good way to confirm this species is if you look at the stem, sort of slightly darkish, reddish purpley tinged stem, and the hairs on it, instead of sticking all around in all directions as they do on the stems of most plants that have hairy stems, it's like they've been sort of, I don't know, brushed to two sides or combed to each of two sides, left and right, along the stem. Quite an unusual feature, very distinctive, and that tells you it's Germander speedwell. Greater stitchwort, stems here are not hairy and they are square in section, very distinctively so, and the leaves are in opposite pairs, slightly greyish tinged and narrow, tapering gradually to a pointed tip, and the flowers are pretty unmistakable, as you can see, those petals deeply cut at their tips, so it looks almost like you've got twice as many petals as you have. Later on they will develop into those funny roundish kind of fruit things that you can press and pop, make a popping noise with them. Great fun. Some more species in the same sorts of places. Wood anemone, well, those flowers are pretty unmistakable, 6 white petals like that kind of shape, easy to tell. The leaves are very deeply divided and they look a bit like buttercup leaves, more or less, or geranium leaves, but they come in whorls of 3 up the stem, and then the flower is further up from that. You can also get leaves just carpeting the ground, masses of them. So it does form carpets in the spring in lots of woods on these acid or neutral to slightly acid soils. Bugle has unmistakable heads, sort of spikes with blue flowers, spikes of a kind of orchidy shape, but the rest of the plant doesn't look anything like an orchid at all. It has creeping stems with leaves that are fairly ordinary shape, really, oval. They've got a few teeth along their edges, blunt teeth, and they taper very gradually towards their bases. Greater woodrush, that's a really easy one to tell. It's kind of a bit like a big grass or a big sedge with really wide, tough textured leaves. You can always tell any kind of woodrush from a grass or a sedge because along the edges of the leaves you get these kind of untidy masses of white hairs that are quite long, irregularly spaced, irregular lengths. There's nothing terribly orderly about them. They look as if, it's a bit like as if the edge of the leaf has been dipped in some kind of glue, some kind of adhesive, and then the whole thing's been touched onto something that's got a lot of loose hairs and then pulled away again, and a lot of these hairs have stuck to it, but you can pull them away quite easily afterwards if you want to do that kind of thing. So of all the woodrushes, greater woodrush is by far the biggest. It's a great big thing, and it can form dense swards like we see here of these bright green leaves and taller stems coming up from them with branched masses of tiny little brown rush-like flowers, very palatable to grazing animals, to the big herbivores. So if you see a lot of it, it's probably an indication that grazing has been on the light side at least for a while, and maybe still is. But you can also get some idea of current grazing by checking out what the leaf tips are like, if they're all tapering right to a full leaf tip, or if a lot of them have been bitten off, which they will do. The animals will happily go in there and eat them. Okay, so now we can move on to woodland on more calcareous or base-rich soils. And here we see more of a change in the canopy. Instead of mostly oak and birch, we get ash and elm coming in quite prominently. There's a big ash tree on the left there. And the ground vegetation also is different. Tends not to be so much a mixture of grasses or dwarf shrubs and small herbs. We don't get the dwarf shrubs really at all here. And the herbs tend to be bigger, lusher ones, some of them with really big broad leaves. We do get some grasses, but then they're different grasses to the ones in the more neutral and acid woodland, ones with bigger, broader leaves. We'll see some photos pretty soon. You can get a lot of hazel too on these more calcareous soils, and in some places it's actually dominant, as it is in some of the places on more neutral soils in the west especially. Here's an example in Argyll on limestone. We can look at species growing on the ground. Well, everything grows on the ground, the trees do, don't they? But you know what I mean, ground flora. And what better species to start with than dog's mercury? We see a patch of it here. You get whole swards of it really that come up in the spring with lots of broad leaves showing well, broad leaves coming in opposite pairs. They've got little teeth on their edges. The flowers themselves are quite inconspicuous. They're kind of yellowy green and they're very small and they come in little catkin-like spikes. It's a distinctive plant though, so it catches the eye quite well as we're walking through the woods. It helps us to pick out some of the areas where the soils are more calcareous. It's also, through much of Britain, quite strongly associated with ancient woods rather than just any other woods. You know, woodland that's had a long history of continuous tree cover that hasn't been felled, hasn't been too interfered with too much. Some more flowers of this this kind of woodland on more basic soils. Woodruff on the left. It's a big bedstraw with leaves in whorls of many, actually 6 to 9, quite big, broadish leaves. It's quite lush for a bedstraw and white flowers. Sanicle has leaves vaguely buttercupish, but they're not hairy. Buttercup leaves are hairy. These ones aren't, and it's got little clusters of white flowers in little sort of blobs at the ends of stalks in the clusters. It's an umbellifer actually. Woodavens, funny looking thing. It's got flowers a bit like buttercups, but they're smaller and petals narrower. And the leaves, the basal leaves, have little leaflets along the left and right sides of the stem, and then suddenly a much bigger leaflet at the end, all the leaflets being toothed. But as you go up the stem, the leaves get a bit smaller and rather simpler, but with jaggy edges. Wild garlic, pretty unmistakable, big broad leaves, sort of long and oval and broad and hairless, and if you crush them they smell of garlic. Then these great big round heads of flowers, and it can form carpets, especially on soils that are a bit damp. It actually overlaps with wet woodland, as we'll see later on. Some more ground flora species in these same kinds of woods. Red campion, it can grow fairly tall, like those ones there with those unmistakable pink flowers, but otherwise you can tell it fairly well by the leaves being opposite pairs. They're sort of medium-sized oval leaves, quite hairy. Both leaves and stems are all pretty hairy. The wood sedge to the right of it, densely tufted sedge with moderately broad yellowy green, mid-green, yellowy green leaves. Loads of those leaves in a tuft, and yeah, it can be lots of flowering stems as well, with those very easy to recognize long kind of catkin-like female spikelets, long and narrow, kind of yellowy green color, and hanging out and down on those long thin stalks. Very delicate kind of look to it. It can get reasonably tall, kind of, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 centimeters, something like that. Wood speedwell, this is a bit like the germander speedwell that we saw earlier in the woodland on kind of neutral to mildly acid soils. But you can see in that photo the hairs on the stems stick out in all directions. Also the leaves are a bit of a more bright yellowy green colour, and they tend to be on sort of more definite stalks, the leaves that come off the stems, whereas in Germander Speedwell the stalks are so short you hardly notice them. And it goes from more neutral to basic soils, the wood speedwell does. Herb Roberts, easy to tell with those very deeply cut leaves that have quite a scent if you crush them, at least in the spring. Further into the year, I've tried it many times and been a bit disappointed by the lack of the smell, because it's a nice smell to look forward to. Little flowers, pink flowers with those 5 petals, pretty easy to tell as well. Other geraniums that grow to the size that this one does, which can get a moderate sort of height, they have bigger flowers like the wood cranesbill or the meadow cranesbill. So quite small flowers and those lovely leaves. A couple of grasses of the same sorts of places. Both of them have leaves that are actually quite broad and that narrow down, not just at the tip as they would in all grasses, but also down towards the base of the leaf blade. So many grasses have a leaf width that continues on at pretty much full width, almost right down to the base of the leaf blade, but not these. These are very graceful leaves, so they're sort of widest around the centre. And in both these two species, the leaves tend to droop down at the tips, so and they're kind of mid-green to yellow-green. Very attractive grasses. Wood melic with those unmistakable, rather big, dark brown spikelets, not that many of them, on these thin branches in the flower head. And wood false brome, which is a bit bigger, taller plant than the wood melic and more tufted, has quite a different flower head. It's not shown in this photo, but it's a bit like, if you imagine, just thinking, if you imagine the flower head of something like barley, where in which someone's come along with the scissors and cut off all those long projecting hair-like awns, those long bristly things, and cut them all quite short. So it's still there, but a bit shorter. It's sort of a bit like that. And the whole, so it's an unbranched flower head, and the individual spikelets within that flower head are narrow and quite long, and the whole flower head can sort of bend over a little bit onto one side. This is a case of trying to picture things in your mind when you can't see them. It's a pretty good exercise and great fun to see how close it gets until sometime when you do eventually see a photograph of the plant or the real thing. Now on this page we've got a selection of species that in NPMS terms haven't got a very good reputation as far as, you know, the condition or quality of the woodland is concerned. So they're classed as negative indicators. The nettle and the goosegrass on the left being classed as such because they tend to get more common in places where there's some eutrophication, some especially kind of artificially high increase in nutrients, maybe from runoff from nearby agricultural land, that kind of thing. And because they can get so more dominant in those places, they can outcompete some of the other species that would otherwise grow there. Ivy can also outcompete things where it grows really lush on the ground. And it can, of course, it can get very thickly grown up tree trunks where it may also outcompete or overshade some of the mosses and liverworts and lichens there. But it's a native species, you know, and I'm not quite sure where do we sort of say that's a bad thing or that's a good thing. It grows pretty well on the ground in places where there's been some disturbance in the past followed by a period of neglect. So if it's very grazed, you don't tend to get so much of the ivy on the ground. Once it gets up the trees, I suppose the amount of grazing is not going to make so much difference. Snowberry, it gets planted in a lot of woodland or woodland margin settings, and it can spread a bit. Distinctive thing, quite attractive thing with those nice white berries that you can't eat, unfortunately. But yeah, it can sort of increase and take over on a smallish scale, not anything like the scale of the other species at the right, rhododendron. That is a serious bad plant because it can take over big areas, and its leaves are so big and evergreen that they cast a really heavy shade. By comparison, the snowberry is not a great worry, really, because the rhododendron is one of our worst problem plant species in this country, really. It especially as it can take over and get really thick and outcompete other vegetation in some of the finest native woods that we have. For example, the western rainforest woods. I had those couple of pictures early on of the mossy woods, wonderful things. And Britain, Western Britain, is sort of globally important for those kinds of woods. And that's just the kind of place where rhododendron does really well. It just likes that climate. A real problem species, and best got rid of. That's easier said than done, of course. So that was dry woods. Now let's have a look at wet woods. Trees and shrubs, mainly alder and some of the willows. Birch, downy birch that is, can be pretty common as well. And here and there some of the trees that we'd seen in the drier woods, like ash, actually can be locally pretty common in some of the wet woodland vegetation. On the ground, very varied. You can have lots of herbs, sedges, rushes, some grasses. So let's go through and have a look at some examples. Here's some downy birch on very wet ground with purple moorgrass, tussocks of purple moorgrass. Big grass forms tussocks. That's one of the grasses, by the way, that has leaf blades that get narrower down towards their bases. And it grows mostly on pretty acid, damp to wet, peaty soils. And it's accompanied here, as it so often is, by that shrub on the right, bog myrtle, which is kind of a bit like a little willowy thing, but it has a very strong resinous smell, beautiful smell. You can rub the leaves and you can smell it. And the stems are kind of a reddish colour as well, distinctive thing. It has little catkins. Attractive shrub, mainly in the north and west. Here is the same species of grass, Molinia, at a different time of year. This is in April. That's last year's growth has gone all sort of buff, pale buff coloured, very washed out. And you can see the brighter pale yellow green of this year's growth. Well, not this year, not 2021, hasn't it? Whatever the year was when I took the photo, starting to come up. Funny thing about Molinia is that those leaves, when they die off, they don't tend to stick to the stem as much as they do in most other grasses. So they kind of break off the leaf blade, that is, breaks off from the leaf sheath, and they form a layer of stuff just in between all the tussocks. And out in the open, it grows commonly out of woods as well. Some of those on a dry day where there's a bit of wind, it can pick up those loose leaves and blow them around. That's probably why it got the name, alternative name, flying bent. Here's some willow. This is grey willow growing over a whole load of soft rush, Juncus effusus. Very species poor woodland ground flora there. It looks like there's a bit of rough meadow grass, Poa trivialis, down at the bottom left hand corner as well. Yeah, just another expression of wet woodland. Quite a lot of mosses on those willow trunks. Willow is a good host shrub for epiphytes. Its bark is sort of more or less neutral and has good texture for a lot of the small species to get a hold, and for bigger ones to do pretty well where the bark isn't so steeply sloping. Here is some more grey willow woodland on wet ground. The photo on the left has a lot of Phragmites, the common reed, growing underneath the willows. It's one of our biggest grasses. It can grow up to a couple of metres tall at least, and the leaves can be very wide, and the leaves grow well up the stems. See those very leafy stems there? Stems are not in tufts. They arise from an underground creeping rhizome, so they come up all over the place, and the species just forms big patches of all these tall, rattling, leafy stems. Beautiful grass. Another species that looks a bit like that is Phalaris, the reed canary grass. It's not quite so big, the leaves not quite so wide, and the flower head, if you've got flower heads in the common reed here, they're very, very branched with lots and lots, huge number of tiny little purplish flower spikelets, whereas in the reed canary grass, they're not so branched. There are far fewer branches, and the spikelets are all kind of bunched up. a bit like the flower heads of Dactylus, the cocksfoot. Also, the reed canary grass has a ligule, which is, like a lot of grasses do, most of our grasses have a ligule, which is a little kind of upright flap at the base of the leaf blade, whereas Phragmites, this one here, the common reed, is one of our few grasses that doesn't have a ligule. The one on the right has the greater tussock sedge, Carex paniculata, one of our biggest sedges. So we've got one of our biggest sedges and one of our biggest grasses on this page. Greater tussock sedge, incredibly tufted, the whole thing building up year by year on these dense stools that can get really pretty tall, a metre or so tall. And the leaves very long, and they have sharply toothed margins. I remember I cut my finger on one once. You have to watch how you handle them. The flower heads are kind of brown with spikelets, brown rather nondescript spikelets arranged mostly in a fairly sort of densish spike at the top of the stem, but really it's the leaves, the tussocky growth form of the whole plant, and those long leaves that catch the eye, and there's nothing else really like it. In this picture we've got more of a mixed assemblage of species on the ground, some grasses and some herbs beneath an alder canopy. So there's a lot of iris, the yellow flag. It's not yet flowering in that picture, but those leaves are unmistakable, these great big flattened sort of tufts, like someone's come along and squashed them into one plane. The yellow flowers a bit behind there are those of the marsh hawksbeard. We'll see a photo of that, closer photo of that a bit later. And there's some soft rush at the lower right corner. Quite a mix of things. That's just to show the kind of appearance of some of these more mixed ground assemblages in some of our wet woodland. Similarly here, again beneath alder, we've got a mixture of grasses and rushes and tall herbs, including marsh thistle and some marsh hawksbeard, and soft rush. I think there's some ferns as well. Yeah, this is a place that's not very grazed, which is how the vegetation on the ground has been able to grow really pretty tall. Some more older woodland on wet ground. It's pretty flat wet ground here on a valley floor in Glencoe. And the ground vegetation is tall and lush, and it consists mostly of tufted hairgrass, Deschampsia cespitosa, a very distinctive grass, which is about as distinctive as that greater tussock sedge that we saw earlier on. Those are both species that are very densely tufted, but this doesn't get quite as big on the whole as that greater tussock sedge. But again, it is very dense tufts or tussocks of pretty long, rather tough textured leaves. In the case of the Deschampsia cespitosa here, the leaves, they have an incredibly rough texture to their upper surface. That's because they've got a series of ridges and grooves that run the length of the upper surface of the leaf, and they've got tiny little forward pointing prickly hairs on them. You can't really see them, but you can feel them if you get the sort of leaf blade between your finger and thumb and try and sort of move your hand downwards towards the base of the leaf. It kind of sticks, whereas if you move it the other way, it just goes straight through. It feels kind of smooth. What you don't want to do is to put some of that leaf in your mouth. I did that once years ago. It was a silly thing to do, and it started going down my mouth because of the direction of those little hairs, I suppose. And it took quite a lot of coughing and spluttering to get it out. I haven't done that since. It was a long time ago. See the flower heads in there, those sort of pale flower heads. They're distinctly big branched flower heads. The individual flowers are very small, but the whole head is very big, and when it's opened out, as it does eventually, it starts off narrow like a lot of grasses with the branches all held up against the main flower stalk, and then they open out, and this is sort of big airy flower head, beautiful flower head. Later in the year they die off, those flower heads, to become very pale, and they can stand out. You can see them from quite a long distance. They remain like that well into the winter, and the leaves, some of the leaves remain well through the winter. The old leaves go very pale, Those that aren't so old are pretty dark, and you often see this with a sort of dark and pale salt and pepper colour effect when you look down into a tuft of the leaves of this species. The ground flora here, with a lot of nettle and goosegrass and butterbur and some sweet cicely, is very lush. It's a kind of ground flora that we get on very nutrient-rich soils, in places where maybe the nutrient enrichment has come at least partly from adjacent agricultural land where there's been some agricultural treatment to the fields, or stuff that's been brought down by the adjacent river when the water level's been higher. And we can get a big lush growth of fairly soft textured plants, like the goosegrass and the nettle. Well, the leaves are pretty soft textured, even though they will sting you, of course. But it can grow really, really tall. You can get a real forest of butterbur, for example, growing, a couple of meters tall by the middle of the summer. Yet it dies down really very, very efficiently, and you get left with very little in the winter. They can look like different places totally. And here's another example on soils that appear to be nutrient enriched. This is actually in a plantation of non-native poplars, but again there's lots of nettle, there's goosegrass, there's also wild garlic growing in there. You can see its white flowers. That's a species that straddles dry and wet woods, as do the nettle and the goosegrass as well, actually all these species. So this is wet woodland in what appears to be a rather eutrophicated place. Very, very, very lush. Will probably die down to something much shorter and sparser in the winter. Wild garlic, by the way, it looks so lush in the summer, and it's virtually nothing to see in the winter. It can be bare ground in some places where it's the dominant species in the summer. Here are closer views of some of the species that we get on the ground in wet woods. And it's not just on this page, there'll be some more pages, by the way, of closer views of ground layer species, not just these four. There, we have at the left marsh marigold, heart-shaped leaves that can get quite big, and they've got little teeth along their edges. The flowers are pretty big and yellow, a bit like buttercup flowers, but bigger. The plant is related to buttercup, and it flowers quite early. The first flowers can come through in early spring. Marsh hawksbeard is a bit more dandelion-like. The flowers look rather like dandelion flowers, and the leaves do too, actually, in that they've got some quite big teeth that point backwards. Backward pointing teeth is not a common feature among plants in this country anyway. But you won't mistake it for dandelion because it grows taller, it's more branched, the leaves taper more gradually to more of a pointed tip. Dandelion is unbranched and has only one flower at the tip of each of its stems, whereas this thing, marsh hawksbeard, has branched stems, so you can get quite a lot of flowers by the time you get to the top, and you have some of the leaves going up the stems as well. Yellow pimpernel is a low creeping plant with leaves in opposite pairs and little yellow flowers. The leaves look a bit like the leaves of chickweed, Stellaria media, which has white flowers though, and chickweed's stems have a line of white hairs running along up one side of them, whereas the yellow pimpernel is hairless. It can also look a bit like a thing called creeping jenny, Lysomachia nummularia, but that's a more southern plant, a more restricted southern distribution, and it has broader, more heart-shaped leaves. The marsh pennywort on the right has round leaves that you could hardly mistake for anything else, really. Maybe wall pennywort, or navelwort as it's sometimes called. But that's got leaves of a much thicker texture, and it grows on rocks, so there's a big difference. Although, funnily enough, having said that, I once found marsh pennywort growing on rocks. That was in the far west of the Scottish Highlands, in an area where there's very high rainfall, very frequent rain, one of those kind of places where even if you're on steep ground, or in this case a kind of rocky bank, even though it's steep and well drained, it can be pretty wet because the climate is just so relentlessly wet. And so there on a steep rocky bank growing among the rocks, or kind of in a rock crevice really, was marsh pennyworts. That was an exceptional thing. Basically, if you find round leaves like that on wet squelchy ground, it's going to be marsh pennyworts, because the other thing grows on rocks. Some more plants here that we can get in these wet woods, and also in open places, as you can see from the two left-hand photographs which are taken out in the open. Purple loosestrife, it's got these narrow oval leaves in opposite pairs, and then a tall narrow spike of pinky purple flowers. Quite a distinctive thing, really catches the eye when it's in flower. Grows in various kinds of wetlands, and also can come into wet woodland as well. Likewise, wood clubrush, likewise as far as habitat's concerned, not its appearance. Obviously, it looks actually more like the greater woodrush that we saw a picture of earlier. Broad yellowy green leaves, but not with those funny long white hairs that you get along the edges of woodrush leaves. But yeah, again, it's got a branched flower head with lots of very small brown flowers in it. It's a kind of sedge, really, and it grows in wet places, unlike the greater woodrush. Marsh bedstraw, it looks kind of a bit like the heath bedstraw we saw earlier, especially in that it's got the very, very tiny white flowers. But it's got a rougher texture because the stems and the leaves have along them these very small, rather backward pointing, slightly prickly feeling hairs, whereas the stems of the heath bedstraw are smooth, and the leaves of the heath bedstraw have forward pointing hairs that don't feel rough. Marsh bedstraw grows a bit taller than heath bedstraw, kind of scrambling really up amongst taller plants. If it weren't doing that, I don't think it would be able to grow so tall if it didn't have the help of other things to grow up among. Meadowsweet, that's an easy plant to recognise, either by its clusters of creamy coloured, nicely scented flowers that we can see there, or by its leaves. The leaves are kind of vaguely like the leaves of an ash tree in that they've got leaflets in pairs on either side, and then a final leaflet at the end. The leaflets are quite strongly toothed along their edges, and as you can see from that photo, actually, if you look at the texture of the leaf along the side veins of the leaflet rather than leaf, sorry, you can see that light and dark pattern because of a sort of up and down shape of the leaf surface in between the different side veins, so it's not dead flat. But even more distinctive than that in the leaf of meadowsweet is the fact that in between the pairs of leaflets you've got kind of minute little, don't know what you would call them really, like a vague attempt at this kind of leaflet. They're really minute but not too small to see, and interspersed between the ordinary leaflets. That's an unmistakable feature. Also, the stems get quite reddish, and the leaf stalks themselves also quite reddish, so sort of double colours really, reddish in the stalks, green in the leaves, and then those funny imitation sort of miniature leaflets. Marsh thistle, it's darker than the other common thistles because it's got a purpley tinge along the edges of the leaves and up the stems, and the flowers are a bit darker as well than they are in creeping thistle and spear thistle, which are the other very common thistles. And it likes wettish, neutral soils. Water avens, related to that wood avens that we saw earlier, but instead of having yellow flowers that stick up, it's got dull pinky flowers that droop down and that don't open out widely. Maybe it looks a bit sad, they're drooping down and not able to open out, feeling sorry for themselves. But it's actually a nice plant. Yellow flag, that's the iris that we saw. We just saw the leaves of it in an earlier photo. Big, tall plant, unmistakable, great big yellow flowers. That likes wet, neutral soils. And here's another view of the purple moorgrass we've seen in a few photos. Tussocks of it on typically wet soils that are a bit acid and peaty. The other three species in this photo like more neutral soils, but the purple moorgrass likes it on the whole a bit more acid. Negative indicators in wet woodland. The nettle and the goosegrass again, just as was the case in the dry woodland, and for the same reason, eutrophication and taking over and ousting out other species. And then three different ones here. Himalayan balsam. These are three introduced species. Himalayan balsam, well, it's well known, you know, it can get into wettish places, riverbanks especially, in the lowlands, and just spread and spread, especially as the watercourse carries the seeds downstream. It's an annual. It's an incredible plant actually that it can grow so massive just for an annual species. Yeah, quite tricky thing to eradicate. Not surprising to find that on the negative list. Western skunk cabbage, absolutely incredible looking flowers, but it can spread in some places. And you can understand how it could maybe outcompete things. See how big those leaves are compared with the nettle leaves. This is a big plant. Impressive though. Giant hogweed, equally impressive and even bigger. Incredible thing. Photo doesn't probably do it justice. It's like ordinary hogweed, but just much bigger. And it's kind of poisonous because if you handle it, you can get nasty rashes and things on your skin, or at least I think it's when the sunlight comes on your skin afterwards. Not a good thing. Oh, hedgerows. Now we can. This is the third final division of this broadleaved woodland habitat. These are hedgerows of native species. Hawthorn, probably overall about the commonest one. Blackthorn and elder are two other ones that are common. Hawthorn and blackthorn being NPMS positive indicators here. Others, quite a few others, broom and gorse, holly, and the other kind of vegetation lower down, smaller plants along hedgerows, tends to have something in common with both grassland and woodland. So here's Dog's Mercury in the centre, in the lower part of the page. On the bottom left, we've got some ferns. Bottom right, there's garlic mustard Alliaria, which is very much a woodland margin and hedgerow plant. It likes that kind of semi-shade thing with little white flowers in the spring and these jaggy-edged, rather triangular leaves. Climbing plants can do pretty well in hedgerows as well. Honeysuckle, ivy and hedge bindweed seen here. There's some more actually going to be in a couple of pages time. Honeysuckle and ivy very common and also listed as NPMS positive indicators here. Bramble and roses, these can be very common along hedgerows too, and contribute pretty significantly to the overall structure of the vegetation. I don't know quite why bramble is listed as a negative indicator here, because this is a habitat in which I would have thought it could do quite well without outcompeting a lot of other great botanical interest, which it might otherwise do in places like grasslands, for example. If some grassland that's been maintained by grazing and is pretty interesting was then undergrazed, less grazed, or not grazed at all, and everything kind of went rank, and bramble might be one of the things that would come in and be leading to species poor vegetation, and it could be out competing other things. But not, I wouldn't expect it so much like that in hedgerows. Yeah, some more climbing plants that we get down south, from left to right. Hop and Traveller's Joy in the left photo, and then white bryony, and then the inset photo, the leaf of black bryony, quite a different looking leaf. Yeah, they can scramble up really very thickly and prominently in hedgerows in southern parts of Britain, and great plants, especially perhaps the Traveller's Joy. It's quite unmistakable. You get massive, great big sort of fluffy looking masses of it in some hedgerows, especially where the soils are a bit more basic or calcareous. Some more plants of the hedgerow habitat that are listed here as NPMS positive indicators. Heart tongue fern, unmistakable fern. It grows in tufts and its fronds are not divided up as they are in most ferns, and they're quite leathery, and it likes fairly calcareous or base-rich soils. Lords and Ladies has these sort of hairless leaves with a heart-shaped base and that unmistakable flower with that funny thing in the middle, which then can turn to a spike of red berries, poisonous berries, later on. Enchanter's Nightshade has leaves in opposite pairs. The leaf shape, they're sort of oval to triangular, a bit like the leaves of some poplars or birches, funny enough. And then these spikes, branched spikes of tiny white flowers. Foxglove, unmistakable plants. Don't need me to explain any more about that one, I'm sure. Dogwood and Spindle, southern species that we can get. Dogwood, they both got leaves in opposite pairs. Dogwood's leaves are quite distinct, broad oval, and it's like the veins, the side veins are trying to get to the edge, but somebody's stopping them because they bend around. They're going towards the edge and they just keep bending around, they never get there. Spindle leaves are a bit narrower, a bit less distinctive, but the fruits are unmistakable. See that pink thing sort of divided up into all those sections. Nothing else like that in the British native flora. These umbellifers are a common sight along many hedgerows, especially where the soils appear to be kind of neutral as judged by the rest of the flora anyway, and where there's not too much grazing. And they've all got pinnately divided leaves, divided up in a more intricate way in rough chervil and hedge parsley and cow parsley, less so in hogweed, which is altogether a bigger, coarser plant. It's got a very rough textured, thicker stem, and the umbels of flowers can get pretty big. Cow parsley is actually classed as an NPMS negative indicator, apparently because it's been found thickening up in some places where there appears to have been quite a bit of nutrient enrichment. There's some cow parsley on the left. The other species on this page, this is the last page of this presentation by the way, the other species are listed as positive indicators in this hedgerow habitat. Burdock, great big thing, huge heart-shaped leaves and those funny fruits that stick to your clothes. Ground ivy that carpets the ground, has roundish leaves in opposite pairs and little crenulate kind of blunt teeth around their edges. Barren strawberry that looks like wild strawberry but doesn't have fruits, and its leaflets have hairs that stick out on the undersides, whereas in wild strawberry, which does have the fruits, the hairs are so closely pressed they're much harder to see. Lesser stitchwort looks a bit like the greater stitchwort we saw earlier, but the whole plant is smaller. The leaves are much smaller and shorter. The stems are thinner and quite wiry. The flowers are a bit smaller and the petals a bit thinner. It's really more of a grassland plant, but it can grow along hedgerows. And the greater stitchwort can be along hedgerows too, actually. Goldenrod, this is particularly common in rocky places. Has a fairly stiff stem, fairly ordinary looking oval leaves, and then these lovely spikes of yellow flowers. So that brings us to the end of this presentation about broadleaved woodland. I hope you've enjoyed it, hope you found it interesting, hope you found it more useful, and yeah, I'll say bye bye.